I want to once more thank everyone for joining us today. So today's topic for the webinar hosted today by the Movement for Liberation from Nakba is on today's topic on normalizing Israel, whose agenda, a very important topic to discuss, especially when matters of geopolitical tensions are rising, especially with regards to the concept of Israel's place in the larger geopolitical game that's being played right now, especially to do with Palestine, the Middle East, and the world over. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us today on this special webinar that we're hosting. And I'm not going to speak much because I would like to pass the floor now to our capable moderator, John Minto. John, I'll let you introduce yourself and our speakers as well. The floor is yours.
Kia ora Hassanal, thank you very much. Enga mana, enga reo, enga hoe wha, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Those are a few words of welcome to everybody in the language of the indigenous people of this country, Māori people. And those words say a welcome to all the speakers, a welcome to our distinguished guests, and a welcome to everybody from around the world who's joined us for this really important webinar this evening. I've got a few sort of introductory remarks, and then we'll pass over to our two speakers, whom we're really privileged and really delighted to have on our talk today, on our webinar today. So the topic is about, normalizing with Israel. I mean, whose agenda is being followed here? And it's important, what I want to do is put that into the context of what's happened over the last 20 years. Because over the last 20 years or so, there's been a growing gap between the views of the people of the world and the views of their governments with regard to the Middle East. The people of the world have been moving inexorably towards support for the Palestinian struggle, but the governments of the world remain very stubbornly supportive of Israel, while mouthing platitudes about supporting a mythical two-state solution and all that goes with that. So also on display recently has been the hypocrisy of Western governments, who have rightly and roundly condemned Russia for its invasion and occupation of Ukraine, but have looked the other way again and again when Israel's occupation army and illegal settlers work hand in hand to ravage Palestinian communities on a daily basis. These same governments shout themselves hoarse over Russia, but then issue calls for calm and restraint when Israel's unbridled violence provokes Palestinian retaliation and Palestinian resistance. So those are two, I think, really important observations that we should keep in mind as we go through the seminar. And the last few years have featured moves by the US and Israel to normalize relations with Arab states through the so-called Abraham Accords. And this is a strategy which could only be described as tacky and cynical. So what do I mean by that? Let's look at three of them. So for example, the UAE has agreed to normalize relations with Israel in return for the US providing the UAE with F-35 fighter jets. In Morocco's case, normalization with Israel is on the basis of the US recognizing Morocco's illegal occupation of Western Sahara. And in Sudan, it has normalized relations with Israel because the US agreed to remove Sudan from its terrorist state list and remove economic sanctions against Sudan, provided it normalizes with Israel. So despite those agreements, the people of those three countries are very strongly supportive of the Palestinian struggle. So in this webinar, we're going to look more closely at this gap between the governments of the world and their people with regard to how they see issues in the Middle East and what implications this has for Palestine. We'll also be looking at what can be done to remove this gap in favor of Palestinians. So tonight we're joined by two really very distinguished guests to talk about this issue. And the first of them is Dr. Alam Fakro. So Dr. Fakro is a research fellow at the Center for Gulf Studies at the Institute for Arab and Islamic Studies at Exeter University and an associate fellow at Chatham House. So without further ado, a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Fakro, and we're heading over to you. Over to you. Kia ora.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, John. Ilham is fine, and it's wonderful to be here today. I'm I'm really honored to be in such distinguished company. So thank you very much. So for my kind of contribution, I just wanted to draw out a few themes, generally about the trajectory of normalization and specifically about the Gulf states and what it means. So first of all, just to take us a little bit to the past, the Abraham Accords are significant because they mark a significant break from the past and the general broad history of public Arab solidarity with the Palestinians. So going back to 1948, with the Arab boycott of the State of Israel upon its creation, this continued in 1967. After the conflict, the Arab states came together again around the Khartoum Declaration and again collectively refused to negotiate with Israel or recognize it until it returned the lands it had occupied during that conflict to Egypt, Syria, etc. The most recent iteration of the joint Arab position is the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, spearheaded by Saudi Arabia, in which 22 Arab states offered Israel effectively peace in exchange for the return of lost territory during the previous conflicts between Arabs and Israel, and the creation of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital and a just solution to the refugee issue of Palestinians. So throughout, since 1948 and even a little bit before, there has been a collective joint Arab position in support of the Palestinians and in support of the other Arab states at the front lines of the conflict with Israel. Now, throughout this history, there have, of course, been two notable exceptions, right? So Egypt in 1979 entered into its peace treaty with Israel, Jordan in 1994. Both of these were done very pragmatically. They were done to recover lost territory, in Jordan's case, to settle border and water sharing issues. And what characterized these agreements, although they are peace agreements, was the fact that they were built around this idea of a cold peace. They were pragmatic, they were done to settle what needed to be settled. And at the same time, there was never this kind of warm embrace of Israel as we're seeing today with the Abraham Accords. And that's also what sets them apart. I mean, two factors here. They are peace agreements between parties who have never been at war. The UAE has never been at war with Israel. But at the same time, there is this embrace and recognition and celebration of Israel's Zionist ideology, which really hasn't happened in the past, even between the Arab states that have normalized relations with it. To me, the second point that's worth discussing is how this marks a crisis, not only a crisis for the Palestinians who have, seen really the solidarity in favor of their cause fall apart because of this, but it's also a crisis of governance within the Gulf states. It showcases that kind of governance and it's this kind of crisis, and it's a crisis of unrepresentative governance. And the reality is in the Gulf states that none of this would have been possible without the creation and development of the kind of infrastructure over the past decade that has effectively curbed dissent and hampered mobilization. So in the case of Bahrain, there's been a body of legislation enacted since 2011 to heighten penalties for dissent, for criticizing the government. And even in the weeks leading up to the Accords, there was specific legislation tightening penalties for individuals expressing views contrary to government's policy or criticizing the government on social media, and particularly for state employees. So I think we have to recognize that these agreements rest on a bedrock of infrastructure that is fundamentally repressive. And in spite of that, there has been mobilization against normalization, particularly in Bahrain. So when this agreement was announced, there were petitions from both pro and anti-government groups. I mean, even from groups that are normally supportive of government policy, they took massive risks by coming out and saying, this is not a decision that we agree with. There were small-scale protests at the time. This was during kind of the peak COVID time, and despite that, there were small-scale protests. And I think, importantly, polling data shows us the same thing. So the Washington Institute for Near East Policy in Washington carried out a poll on the eve of the Accords in the UAE, asking the question, do you agree that individuals who want to have ties with Israel, whether in sports or business, should be allowed to do so? And 80% of respondents answered no to that. So before the Accords, really very little support for this kind of thing. The Arab Opinion Index has also done work around this and found support to be in the single digits across the Gulf states for normalization. And the aftermath of the Accords, what's really interesting is the Washington Institute again carried out a similar poll, and results hadn't really changed much. So really that hasn't actually changed public opinion on the matter, which remains deeply supportive of the Palestinians. And so this kind of brings me to the third point I wanted to discuss, which is, if these agreements are so unpopular, then why are states entering into them? Why is that happening? To me, this is there are factors beyond kind of a single exchange of hardware or kind of a single transaction. It's much broader and it's much more systematic in a way. So going back even to the 90s, the earliest forms of cooperation between Israel and the Gulf states, which took place kind of underneath the surface, but they were there as early as the 90s, really centered around their shared threat from Iran and their shared threat perception from Iran and their shared kind of desire to push back against Iranian influence in the region. More recently, since 2011, there's also been a convergence around US retrenchment. So for the Gulf states, back in 2011, the Obama administration announced its intention to draw down from the region, from the Middle East generally, and kind of pivot to Asia to contain what they see as the rising threat from China. And this has rung alarm bells in the Gulf states. And as a result of that, they've pivoted a little bit towards Israel with this idea that they need greater security guarantees from someone, given that the US is planning to take a kind of a backseat in the region. If not a backseat, then at least draw down a little bit. And so this has been another motivator for greater ties with Israel. And what we're seeing now is this real triangulation that's taking place with the US playing this intermediary role in encouraging not only normalization between the Gulf states and Israel, but also air and missile defense coordination and cooperation between Israel and the states that are not involved in the Accords. So one of the main things that's happened since the enactment of the Abraham Accords is moving Israel from the European zone of command to CENTCOM, where it's in the same grouping as the rest of the Arab states, the Gulf states and others. So just that move facilitates all kinds of defense cooperation between the Arab states and Israel, even when there is no normalization. So I think what I also want to highlight is the fact that normalization is also affecting the countries that haven't signed on to the Accords because of things like this. And the move of Israel to CENTCOM also accompanies many other things, including there's been a passage of the Defend Act in the US recently, and that also facilitates certain kinds of cooperation, which are a bit too technical and detailed to talk about here. For the two Gulf states that have normalized, I think there's also the factor of reputational redemption. Both have used their new relationship with Israel to portray themselves as liberal, as tolerant, particularly towards a Western audience that has criticized them for their human rights records in the past. So there is that element of it there too, of really kind of strategic reputational management. So, I mean, I think this is really most of what I wanted to go through. I think I don't want to leave on a terribly bleak note, but there are also reasons to be optimistic. What the past looked like was the Arab states really acting as the champions of this cause within the context of the global climate that really didn't care too much about the Palestinian cause. And I think you touched on this a little bit, John. What we're seeing now is in some ways a move towards the reverse of that, as the Arab states are kind of leaning towards Israel a little bit more, joining the Accords, or at least engaging in covert cooperation or cooperation that's behind the scenes. We're seeing a much bigger rise in solidarity with the Palestinians globally. And I think this is something that I would be interested in unpacking with other panelists and having be the focus of the rest of the discussions here today. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Fakro. That's really a really fascinating talk. I really like the way you summed up the situation by talking about this is really a crisis of unrepresentative government, where you have governments at the governmental level doing deals that are deeply unpopular among the citizenry of those countries. So thank you very much for that. Yes, and I think if you've encouraged people to ask questions, and so if people put questions in the Q&A, we'll pick up those questions after our two speakers and after Chandra, our discussant, has had his say. So thank you very much. And so we're moving on now to our second speaker, Dr. Shari Plonsky. And Dr. Plonsky is a senior lecturer in international politics at Queen Mary University in London. And her work, which is anchored in the political terrain of Palestine and the Israeli state, focuses on materiality and mobility of colonial relations and the struggles that reveal and challenge them. So a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Plonsky. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Kia ora.
Thanks very much, John, and also to Hassanal and the entire community at MLN for organizing this. And for inviting me. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully it works. Okay, does everybody see that?
Yep.
Yeah, pretty. So you have nice things to look at besides me. And so yeah, so in my work, I've spent the last 5 years interrogating Israel's infrastructural plans for harnessing trade and transit corridors across the Middle East, and how through particular markets, nodes, and interlocutors in the region and beyond, how Israel's also been moving into and extending and amplifying its access to global financial, technological, diplomatic, and security channels, making it seem as if it's like this urgent and necessary, concrete, and very much unchallengeable partner. And to me, these projects really embody the epitome of normalization, and also perhaps point us to tangible ways of disrupting them. But to talk about this, I am going to now need to backtrack a little and tell you a bit more about where my thinking comes from. And hopefully this will make sense. So I've watched this kind of slow incremental making of these lines of connection and circulation, what I call infrastructural corridors, since I started following the inauguration of what Israel calls the Ha'emek Railway in 2016. And this started just about a few months before Benjamin Netanyahu launched the train in a public speech where he called the Ha'emek a potential peace train that would change the future of the Middle East and Israel's place in it. Now, this train he was talking about, let me see if I can get here. So this train he was talking about is about 65 kilometers long, takes 45 minutes to travel end to end from Haifa's port terminals to 4 kilometers just shy of Jordan's border in Beit Shan, or what used to be Baisan. For passengers, it's a total of about 9 stops. It seems innocuous. It travels between Israel's backwater peripheries, which have their own story of under and development, a story that we'll leave for another time. But the Ha'emek barely made a glitch in critical conversations about Palestine. No one was looking. And this is probably because it was moving in what felt like a parallel universe, seemingly and intentionally disassociated from the much more spectacular modes of violence happening in Gaza or the West Bank, or even closer to home in Palestinian villages within the Green Line, only a few miles from the train. Everywhere else, you really see blood, you see walls, you see checkpoints, you see apartheid roads, you see soldiers, you see settlers, you see displacement, clear examples of removal, erasure, and replacement. But the train seemed and still seems very much scrubbed clean of violence. And this is what I think is really relevant to our conversation today. As we try to track down and make visible agendas and projects aimed at normalization, it's these off-the-radar plans that I think need our attention and very much point us to the gaps and holes in our thinking about Palestine and the violence of the settler colonial state, as it moves both visibly and invisibly in material and virtual, conceptual and ideational, ordinary and spectacular ways. Because projects that orchestrate and underwrite Israel's mobility are always very much intimately tied to projects that underwrite Palestinian immobility. As Dorian Massey tells us, to make some things flow, others always must be controlled, secured, and blocked. Violence is an essential requirement to make things move, even if you can't see it. And violence very much accumulates in these projects and then is reproduced, embedded, naturalized, and normalized through them. Sorry. So from the beginning, this train, which really does go nowhere, was already being imagined as a train to everywhere. Very much the epitome of a fantasy to make Israel normal through the physical project of overland transport infrastructures across the region. The UAE and Gulf states and the scaled up financial potential they offer were always the shiny horizon to which it aimed, something that seemed impossible in 2016, but as we see, much less impossible in 2023. There was also this deep nostalgic tinge to this imagined landscape of normalcy, one that might be familiar to students and scholars of colonial nostalgia, in which Israel positioned itself in the Ha'emek as inheritors of the Ottoman Empire's Hijaz Railway, which once linked Haifa to Damascus, Amman to Medina. And then during the British Mandate, also linked the rail further south to East Kantara and Port Said, following the spoils of this virgin, like another phase of the empire, and then was connected to a brand new deep sea port that the British built in Haifa to circulate oil, minerals, and goods from the newly integrated Mandate states in the region. That is all before its disruption in 1948 and the train's final closure in 1951, due to one reads as a lack of resources or supposed need for this route inland in national archival documents about the train. And after that, and after this moment, Israel's seaports would become the only way for goods to move in and out of the country. And until today, 99% of all goods reach Israel through the sea. And what becomes really normal in this telling of Israeli history is obviously this erasure of Palestine as the node in this connective infrastructure. Even the name of the train is left off all posters or propaganda. It was the Palestine Railways. Or the fact that the disruption that is spoken about regarding the train and its overland routes from Haifa occurred first because Yishuv militias physically blew up the bridges that connected the train to Syria and Jordan in 1946 and 1947. And that disruption was obviously sustained because of the violence of an ongoing Nakba that severed Palestine from the Middle East and North Africa. So this is what already lives in Israel's making of a train to everywhere, out of a train to nowhere. One where Palestine does not and never did exist. Which leaves the pathway very much open for a future without Palestine as well, which to me is at the center of the normalization project, really to make Palestine disappear. So coming back to our infrastructural lens, which is kind of the shaping of this kind of project I've been doing, I want to come back to Deb Cowan. So Deb Cowan has been writing about settler colonial, racial capitalist, and carceral infrastructural terrain for at least the last decade, and has been key to helping me think through Israel's work to concretize its infrastructural fantasies as fundamental to normalization. She points to how infrastructure enables and supports or disrupts and alienates the possibility of motion and movement, connection, and circulation. And in the context of colonialism, she and others like Nick Estes, Audra Simpson, Omar Jabari Salamanca, Manu Karaka have written incredible amounts about the premise of infrastructure being dispossession, extraction, destruction, and alienation of indigenous space and life. There is no train, no pipeline, no court, no law that isn't also tied to legacies of violence, blood, conquest, carcerality. And there are uneven iterations across the world. And this isn't something that's just relegated to history. As Lale Khalili writes in this gorgeous book, Sinews of War and Trade, this violence has left indelible marks that continue to shape contemporary trade and transit routes. In our current global dependence on the smooth, uninterrupted movements of goods and capital, coloniality continues to determine who and what threatens these flows, as well as where and how to structure them. And so again, as Deb Cowan says, there is no circulation, no global supply lines, no integrated chain of retail and commodity, manufacture and market without prisons, borders, camps, and reserves, and the criminalization, police services, surveillance, and security apparatus that accompany and accumulate through them. But most importantly, because infrastructure exists to underwrite and materialize connectivity, the very dense physical and violent modes of its making and unmaking quite easily really disappear into the background noise. It becomes an ambient unseen. It's a hyper-present and seemingly durable part of daily life, essential to everything we do, eat, consume, buy, turn on, ride, and so on. So long as things move, and according to the logics of capital accumulation and circulation, everything must move, must keep circulating, must keep flowing at like hyper speeds. And so long as everything works, and of course, everything must work, it must work smoothly and unflinchingly, infrastructure, and particularly corridors of connectivity, operate by being invisible in plain sight. And they remain invisible by displacing violence, friction, and disruption elsewhere onto distant places and distant lives. It doesn't even have to be that distant, it just needs to be somewhere else. And this is what I think we're talking about when we're thinking about linking the Hammock Railway to regional and global supply lines and markets, a project that to me has at its core an interest in the displacement, containment, and management of violence, threats, and disruptions, so it can remain invisible, normal, and normalizing. And all the active, intentional work of securing, surveying, managing life and friction in Palestine further disappears into the background, swallowed by the kind of mobility infrastructure, seemingly endless attempts to what's called eating space and time. Hold on, this isn't working. So what's amazing, though, to me about the Hammock Project is that it really isn't invisible at all. And we're watching it come into being in increasingly visible and acutely spectacular processes. It's no longer just moving in the background and under the radar. So, starting back in let's say 2017, 2018 with Israel's tracks for regional peace plans, when then Finance Minister Israel Katz shopped around the Gulf region and introduced at every state visit, this precursor to discussions that led to the signing of the Abraham Accords. They were talking about this train that was going to connect the region. You have Trump's economic prosperity to peace plans, in which the train linking Palestine to the region and to Haifa port is this featured element and targets investors and real estate speculators. You have even more recently, the 2021 Shanghai International Report Group, China's biggest port operator launching their brand new automated terminal in Haifa Bay and effectively linking Israel's shipping circuits to one of the most connected logistics networks in the world, at the heart of which is China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is like these 10,000 kilometers of connected land and sea routes intended to link Europe, Africa, and Asia. And then again, in 2022, you have the Adani Group, India's largest private port operator and one of India's biggest commodity conglomerates, buying the old Haifa port and adding it to their port portfolio, and therefore linking Israel to a parallel land and sea trade network to those orchestrated by SIPG. And all of this is, surrounded and supported and imbricated in like all these other super high profile projects that shape the space in which Israel's operating and being amplified through these Abraham Accords. So you have like the $10 billion trade deals between UAE and Israel and memorandums of understanding that establish flows between the startup and scale up nations. You have the new I2U2 forum, which constitutes what's been called like the new mini-lateral quad of Israel, India, UAE, and the US. And I just can't resist mentioning this project called the Great Green Wall Initiative, which is a project that spans 22 countries to reforest 100 million hectares of degraded land in Africa, and Israel becoming one of its key partners at the COP27 because of its expertise allegedly in desert-based agri-tech and desertification techniques, effectively turning Israel's Make the Desert Bloom project and the land with no people, people without land mythology upon which it's based into a critically needed approach to climate change and desertification, both of which should be interrogated themselves as colonial processes. But that's, again, we can have a different conversation about that. But even calling Israel the startup nation, as it's allegedly known, is really about normalizing Israel's knowledge and mode of practice, which everyone here, I'm sure, knows is a euphemism for security, surveillance, and war tech that is field tested on Palestine and Palestinians. And as I continue literally to number off all the new and allegedly excitingly shiny infrastructural projects happening to link Israel to global flows and markets, we're already meant to feel like this is happening regardless of what we do. Normalization starts to feel like a speeding train, one you can't jump off of, even if that train still goes absolutely nowhere, ending 4 kilometers shy of the Jordanian border. But of course, this isn't really the case. We know that as Alam has already pointed to, like really key powerful interlocutors have actively invested in Israel being normalized, like Adani, like SIPG, like UAE, like India, like the US. They have all made it so that if Israel loses, they lose, and they have become completely entangled then in the project of containing, destroying, effacing, and replacing Palestine. And so keeping these two registers of Israeli mobility and normalcy and the violence they cause in Palestine separate and disconnected is key to the success of that project. And so for us, keeping those, keeping the connection visible, putting a spotlight on it is then integral to disrupting normalization and disrupting the idea that this is inevitable or flowing, smooth, or unstoppable. An infrastructural view then really reminds us that nothing is fixed, determined, final, or finished, and that the normalization of Israel isn't any of those things. Without active investment in the project, it literally goes nowhere. So we have this, we can go back to this example of the train again. There are so many holes, physical and conceptual, preventing the corridor from becoming a reality. It requires physical and diplomatic bridges across Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. It requires a huge amount of financial and political investment and the physical, violent containment of anyone who threatens its connection and movement. And so active, tangible acts of disruption, which make visible what is really being normalized here, and other modes and methods of solidarity, connection, and unity, movements, let's say like BDS, are also really key. And I think I'm going to end this intervention with this idea that disruption is really necessary and possible. And I look forward to all the discussion that we'll have about this. Thanks.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Thank you very much, Sherry. That was a pretty amazing presentation. It wasn't what I was expecting at all. And I think you talked about us needing to keep an eye on things that are under the radar or off the radar plans. And the train and the Great Green Wall initiatives. These are things that I know very little about, and they're obviously so important. And I think the way you juxtapose the idea of sort of normalization versus disruption. Our job is to disrupt normalization, because with normalization comes the, I think you talked about making Palestine disappear, and that's at the heart of it. So yeah, thanks for that fascinating presentation. I'm going to have to go on later and look at those maps again and all that stuff, because that was fascinating. Okay, we've got just before we open up for questions. So remember, put your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those shortly. But we've got Dr. Chandra Musafa, who's going to speak to us. He's the president of the International Movement for a Just World, JUST, J-U-S-T, which is a human rights advocacy organization in Malaysia that works to implement global justice rooted in universal moral principles. And Chandra is a very important part of our MLN network, and I welcome him here to give his sort of response to the two speakers we've heard. So kia ora, Chandra, looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, John. I'd like to thank the two speakers for their presentations. I personally learned quite a bit from both the speakers, and especially all those arguments about normalization, which many of us are not familiar with. It's linked with infrastructure development, and an infrastructure development that appears to have a very conscious plan to exclude Palestine as such, which in a sense is reflected in the larger politics. In the midst of normalization, the people who are key to that land and to that region, they are being set aside. The comments that one may want to direct to speakers, I suppose the audience may have questions and so on. But what I would like to do today is perhaps speculate on two possible trends which would impact upon normalization and the response to normalization. If normalization is successful, meaning by which if it goes beyond the 4 states, and you include Kosovo, 5 of them, that had normalized relations with Israel in the recent past, if those who are pushing for the Abraham Accords, pushing for this particular dimension of Israeli relations, if they succeed in bringing in countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, which are very big Muslim majority nations, if they're all persuaded for a variety of reasons to recognize Israel, if that happens, if, let us say, this is followed by other attempts at embracing Israel, and if a situation arrives one day when all those nations that have been reluctant to recognize Israel until now, if they are prepared to go along with Israel, if this happens, if this becomes a new reality, in other words, if there is a push towards recognition of Israel, which is even stronger than what happened after the Oslo Accord, which, as you know, when Oslo happened, the great push was towards recognizing Israel. Countries like China and India recognized Israel after Oslo. Now, if there's a much bigger push this time, what would this lead to? Well, it would be a diplomatic victory for Israel, without any doubt at all. It would weaken the Palestinian cause. But beyond that, what will it mean? In practical terms, because of what I'm going to talk about in a while, it won't mean very much. Yes, many countries will recognize Israel if this continues, with, of course, the United States of America doing all it can to ensure that this happens. Many countries will recognize Israel, and Israel would be happy with all these newly forged diplomatic ties. And they may feel that Palestine has been further isolated. But what it would mean in reality, and this brings me to the second point I want to raise, I don't think it will mean very much. Why do I say this? Because I think there are other developments which work against this type of normalization. The most important of these developments is something that has been alluded to by the first speaker. It's the way people feel about Israel today, the way in which people have committed themselves to the Palestinian cause, much greater than perhaps at any other point since 1948. It's the people's commitment to Palestine, which should be distinguished by the way in which elites are pandering to Israel. That's something else. But here we're talking about the people. John alluded to this point in his introductory remarks. And it is this dimension which I think we should look at. That there is a clear dichotomy developing between elites and people on the question of Palestine. I would like to perhaps add a little bit to this, though it's not directly relevant to what we're going to discuss. This dichotomy between elites and people is expressing itself in many other areas. Take, for instance, something that should be very obvious to us because of what's been happening in Ukraine. You have elites spending billions and billions of dollars, of pounds, in arming Ukraine, while their people are more concerned about bread and butter issues. And this has not been taken care of at all. People are concerned about jobs, about rising food prices, about the galloping inflation. This is what they're concerned about. But the elites, they are obsessed with military hardware. So you see a dichotomy. And you find the dichotomy in many other areas, which is something that people should look at. That this is what the way in which change is taking place and the way in which it's expressing itself in this very clear, stark dichotomy between elites on the one hand and people. So that, I think, is a very important factor. The people are not with this sort of normalization. You can have all the trains in the world, all the infrastructure development, you can forge ties, you can establish relations, trade missions, and all the rest of it, but the people have a different view. And that came out clearly in Qatar during the World Cup, and how ordinary people felt about Palestine, the support that they expressed for Palestine. It may be just a microscopic example of what is taking place, but nonetheless, I think it is important that people are looking at the question differently. And the elites have not understood this. The elites are not responding to the people's feelings. But nonetheless, if you look at some of the meetings that are being held and conferences, some of them are behind closed doors, the elites are worried because they know that there is a dichotomy, that in spite of what they're doing, people are not with them. And believe me, it has had an effect in another respect. They would have pushed much harder, these elites, especially in those countries that chose to normalize relations with Israel in the recent past. Some of those elites, they were hoping that they could bring in Pakistan, using, of course, all sorts of tactics in order to force Pakistan to also recognize Israel. They're hoping that they could perhaps arm twist Indonesia and other countries, and even a small country like Malaysia, it is on their radar, and they're trying these tricks, but it's not working. And the moment people began to speak up, I think there is this feeling that they cannot really push very hard, and they're holding back. They're holding back. So it is having an impact. So the way people are responding is a very important factor, and that should continue. And that's where I think all of us will be able to play a role. Those of us who are part of civil society, those of us who have taken a stand, I think we should not despair. Just because we see elites forging relations and elites playing their games, at the level of people, it is different. That's a point that we must keep in mind. Number two, if you look at it in terms of the United Nations, though we know that the UN is not effective as far as the Palestinian issue is concerned, but nonetheless, by getting a toe-hold into the Palestinian issue via the United Nations, so I think the UN has been drawn into this development, the changes that are taking place. And the fact that you are now, meaning by which Palestine, state that has got a certain role within the UN process, the fact that there are people who are pushing very hard for the question of occupation to be submitted to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and there is pressure upon Israel. The fact that these things are happening, insignificant though they may be in terms of the bloodshed and the killing and the violence and so on, they are important, because that's yet another dimension that we must keep in mind. The third dimension, of course, is the BDS movement. It is getting stronger and stronger. More and more companies are getting involved, more and more groups in Europe in particular are signing up to BDS. And that movement, I think, has got tremendous potential. Don't forget, it is a movement that began in Palestine itself. It is rooted in Palestinian society, and that provides some hope. And that movement, I think, is also part of the future that we should be thinking about. There is a fourth factor, and the fourth factor is Israel itself. The more extreme Israel becomes, the more barbaric Israeli behavior is, the greater the reaction of people, not just in Palestine or the Arab world or in the larger Muslim world, I mean, people everywhere. And you're beginning to see it in Europe, United States of America, in countries like Australia, and so on. People are standing up and they are taking a position because of what Israel has done. It's different wars against the people of Gaza, the helpless people of Gaza, over a period of time, the 3-4 raids, invasions that took place. But even in recent years, and in recent times, if you look at the killings that have taken place, especially under the aegis of the new government of Israel, the brutalization, which has reached an extreme level, and then I think is producing a reaction. And this is something which is not unusual. If you look at every great movement for change against colonialism, great movements against apartheid and so on, a regime contributes to the conscientization of the people, developing their consciousness because of their brutality, because of their viciousness, and because of the utterly merciless approach they adopt towards dissent. So that's yet another factor. The fifth and final factor, which may perhaps be one of the most decisive, the global situation is changing, and it's not in favor of Israel, and it's not in favor of those who support normalization or those Arab countries which are part of this game. What do I mean by the global situation is changing? The US has been central to Israeli politics, Israeli power. If Israel is able to do various things, it's pushing for a certain agenda, it is partly because of the United States of America. It is behind Israel, including the Abraham Accords. It's the US. We know the role played by specific officials in the US government as far as the Abraham Accords are concerned. So the US is very important in this whole game, but the US is getting weaker. The US is no longer as dominant as it was. The US is coming to the end of its dominance of the global system. The US will be the last one to recognize it, of course, but we all can see it, that it no longer has the power it once commanded in world trade, in world investments, even in the realm of technology and science, which is central to the rise of power. In history, if you look at all the great powers, science has been a very important factor. But if you look at what's happening in the scientific area, in the area of technology, there are other competitors who are really very, very important now. And the United States is no longer able to hold on to its lead. So in other words, the global situation is changing rapidly against the United States, against the type of dominance that Israel had enjoyed because of US power. So friends, in spite of everything, I think a change is taking place. Now I'll like to conclude by suggesting this, that if what we are seeing is a people's movement aided and abetted in a sense by all the other developments, and if a people's movement has to produce an alternative meaning by which, if in the process of the struggle, we have to show this is what the new Palestine will look like, this is what the new state, society that we have in mind will look like, then I think it is so important for those who are struggling for the Palestinian cause. And I say this is someone who has been totally committed to this cause for a very long while, but I'm not a Palestinian and I'm not from that region. But I think it would be a great pity if we think that in the alternatives that we are envisaging for the future, that the alternatives would be either a Palestinian state that looks like Saudi Arabia or a Palestinian state that looks like Iran. I don't think one should see that as the alternative. Neither should one see this as an alternative between an Islamic state and a secular state, as if these are the only alternatives. And this is the interesting point that I'd like to introduce for our discussion here. Let the people in Palestine and in West Asia, for a moment, turn their gaze to Southeast Asia. The largest Muslim country in the world is here in Southeast Asia. It's Indonesia. Indonesia is today the world's 4th biggest country in terms of population. And it is a country which is poised to become the world's 4th economic power within the next 10 years. given its economic rise. Indonesia is a country that one should look at. And if Palestine is thinking of a social structure, cultural milieu, which is different, I think Indonesia offers something. It is a multi-religious society. The Palestine of the future will have to be multi-religious. There will be not just Muslims, but Christians and Jews and others, and they must all feel that they're part of a society. They must feel that they're treated as equals. And Indonesia had committed itself right from the beginning to a concept of a nation from 1945, which did not project an Islamic state or a secular state in the way in which the term is understood. It has got a philosophy called the Pancasila, 5 principles, the Pancasila. The first principle is the belief in God Almighty, and other principles related to humanitarianism, social justice, consultation, and all the rest of it. That's very interesting, that they evolved something which makes sense within their society. And that is what Palestine, if I may say this, that's what Palestine should also do. If the future is not in the sort of models that have been there for a while, because it may be disastrous in the long run. If you pursue those models, people may turn against you. But if on the other hand, you present something that is very new, which draws upon the fundamental characteristics of your society, and belief in God, it's something which binds both Muslims and Christians, and Muslims and Christians in the Palestinian struggle offer much greater solidarity than you see in many other parts of the world between Muslims and Christians. Now, that sort of belief in God and the values that emanate from that, humanitarianism, justice, the dignity of a human being, all these things should be part of that future. And if that sort of vision is articulated, that vision itself will strengthen the struggle for the future, rather than seeing it as something that is linked to models which are there and which may not offer the best hope for the future. This, to my mind, is something that one may want to look at. As someone from Southeast Asia, for Indonesia's neighbor, let me leave you with this thought, that maybe one has to look east to determine the future of the Palestinian struggle. Thank you.
Kia ora, Chandra. Thank you very much for that. You're, that's a very positive, in terms of a topic which could be very depressing and very leave us all, going away and having an aspirin and having a cup of tea and a lie down. What you've done is you've said that really we have a secret weapon in the struggle for Palestinian liberation. The secret weapon is the people of the world, working against these the elites, which are determining what happens at sort of at 30,000 feet. But in fact, what's happening on the ground is something quite different. And I think, we do always need to remember that. So thank you for that. And I think you've pointed also to the barbarism of this new Israeli regime it's been quite staggering in just the first 2 months. And I think that can only get worse, but at the same time, it offers an opportunity for the people of the world to see in greater clarity what is actually happening there. This is not a conflict in the Middle East. This is a military occupation of the land of Palestine by Israel, which has gone on, the longest military occupation in modern history. So thank you very much for your presentation. I'll be really keen to hear what Shari and Elam think about the positivity which you bring to this discussion. So we've got questions. We'll do this through questions, but Shari and Elam, feel free to jump in on anything which anybody has said, because aside from what's in the actual questions themselves. So, but look, we'll kick into questions and see how we go. So we've got a question from Dr. Abraham. And Dr. Abraham says, normalization of violence, whether it is structural or otherwise, is surely the agenda of any oppressor across the globe. And we see it happening repeatedly in politics, religion, development policies, etc. Palestinian attempts to disrupt this normalization process through a few strikes or other local agitations do not reach anywhere. How do you envision a pathway to Palestinian re-existence? Okay. I think that a pathway to Palestinian, liberation might be a better way of putting that. Alan, I'll throw that to you. and see what you can make of that.
Thank you. So thank you for the excellent comments. I think that was fantastic, and particularly the points about the dichotomies between elites and popular and public opinion, and really seeing this as more of a global trend than anything specific to a region, I think is a really great point. And this need to develop people's movements to address not only the Palestinian issue. I mean, I like linking this to other really serious issues facing the planet, climate crisis, crisis of poverty, lack of representation, authoritarianism. All of these things are deeply linked. Liberation movements for Native peoples and recognition in all sorts of ways. These are all deeply, deeply tied together, and it's the same structures that oppress across the board. So I'm really in favor of trying to create linkages across these meta issues, and I think that's the way you did that in some way with people's movements is absolutely correct and needed in the discussion. Otherwise, we just see ourselves as kind of isolated causes here and there across the globe, whereas I think we really are talking about almost one interconnected issue. So normalization of violence. A pathway to Palestinian re-existence. I think it comes back to this in some way. The more we are able to tie things together as a single global movement for justice, in a way, I think I'm always particularly heartened when I see the Palestinian flag raised in other contexts, right? At climate summits, for example, or movements for rights of indigenous people. I think it's really forging that interconnectivity to me, which is really necessary. But I really would love to hear other views on this as well, and generating grassroots solidarity in a bigger way. I hope I'm articulating that correctly. I mean, should I go down and address some of these other questions and then turn it over to other speakers and panelists?
Yes, I don't think, you need to read the questions, Ellen, because I don't think
okay.
our audience.
Let me do that then, yeah. So the next question is from Steve. Did the Emirates/Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, have a concept of civil disobedience as a feedback mechanism for disaffected civilians, or is civil society seen as a threat rather than a force for social change? I think that's a good question. No, there really isn't space for that at all. And increasingly, there's less and less space for that. So I think civil society is certainly seen as a threat, and there have been all sorts of efforts to subdue civil society, either through co-option, right, or through repressive mechanisms. Both ways, both are strategies that have been used for a very long time. And in some cases, even demographic changes. So bringing in large, foreigners, many amounts of, big groups of foreigners to even change the demography of these countries. And across the board, we are seeing situations where the local populations are in fact a minority in these countries. So these are all ways of subduing civil society, I think. But there isn't room for dissent, and I think that's really the crux of the problem. Otherwise, we wouldn't have normalization. The next question, the Gulf states like the UAE and Bahrain have been, over the years, increasingly viewing Israel as an attractive model to emulate in terms of the management of internal dissent and external security. Here's the situation now. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that fully. Their attempts to procure Israeli technology are not new. So as far back as 2006, the UAE was procuring Israeli satellite data from Iran. In 2008, the UAE began the creation of Falcon Eye. It's a system of cameras providing surveillance over the capital city of Abu Dhabi. It was described as a traffic management system, but even as early as then, that was built on Israeli technology, and it wasn't completed until 2016. I think the Accords, if you look at certain examples, you can see why the Accords are necessary in terms of procuring Israeli technology. So around 2009, there was a proposed project, I think Seawolf it was called, to convert unmanned vehicles into drones by an Israeli provider for the UAE. And the Israeli Ministry of Defense actually blocked the deal, seeing it as potentially undesirable to sell, to provide this kind of technology to a country with which it did not have ties. So there were even limits to cooperation behind the scenes back then without normalization. And you can see now how normalization has actually facilitated that technology transfer, most recently in 2002 with Israel approving some of its missile defense systems for the UAE. So normalization has accelerated this technology transfer. And even when it comes to spyware, which is I think what you're speaking to more specifically, so the use of Pegasus has been since around 2012 found in the UAE pre-normalization, and there's no doubt that normalization itself is going to accelerate the use of these tools by the Gulf states from Israel. And yes, they do view Israel as an attractive model to emulate in terms of the management of internal dissent, especially vis-a-vis the Palestinians. The way that Israel has used technology to subdue and suppress the Palestinians is absolutely something that I think the Gulf states view with some level of what they see as an effective management strategy. Yes, and they are relying on some of those same tools. That is the reality now. And we can expect this to accelerate in the future, I believe. Let me go down a little bit. Syria, I'll leave for someone else. Okay, there's a question down here. The point about the Gulf countries' rulers' gap with their populations' opinion of normalization extends to perhaps the biggest prior that Tel Aviv, Washington, and the Gulf have been pressuring to normalize with Israel, Pakistan, the only nuclear-armed Islamic country of 230 million people with one of the world's most formidable militaries. There, the gap is close to 100% against normalization, while the military and civilian political elites are keen on normalizing for a variety of reasons, including their envy of India's proximity to Israel. It is widely felt that the main factor behind the regime change operation against former Prime Minister Imran Khan was his unequivocal support for the Palestinians and refusal to normalize. And now we have a regime in Pakistan that is completely subservient to Washington. This is of grave concern to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Pakistan. Do you have any thoughts on this? Many thanks for a presentation. Thank you. I don't, this is unfortunately, Pakistan is a gap in my knowledge, at least to this extent of detail. So I would leave it for the other speakers if you're able to talk to speak on whether the current regime or government in Pakistan is moving in that direction, particularly compared to the previous one. I think there's much more expertise on this point than I have. But I think the other side of it, which is maybe something I can speak on a little bit, is that the other prize, I believe, is Saudi Arabia for Israel. And that's just yesterday, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal which covered this recent development that 2 delegations from the US had been to Saudi, and per their reporting, those delegations had spoken to the leadership about normalization, and the question of the Palestinians apparently had not come up at all. It was discussions about the Saudis asking for help with building a civilian or a nuclear program and assistance with US security guarantees in the future in exchange for normalization. So that was seen as the kind of the ask from Saudi Arabia is security guarantees from the US and some nuclear assistance. That's per the Wall Street Journal yesterday. But in the lead up to this, Saudi Arabia has remained committed to the Arab Peace Initiative. So every public statement that Saudi officials have made since normalization, and there have been so many, has been, we are willing to normalize on the basis of the Peace Initiative, which provides for the creation of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. So at least where we are now is at the formal level, Saudi Arabia is committed to that, but behind the scenes, it does look like other things are taking place. And I think one thing that strikes me about this is how quickly things are moving, because there's already defense cooperation behind the scenes between Saudi Arabia and Israel. There's no doubt about that. That's almost public from the American side. And so there's very little that stops us from growing, if not publicly, then behind the scenes. And then once that infrastructure is there behind the scenes, it's a matter of time really before it becomes public facing, in my view. So there is a real question on Saudi Arabia in terms of how or when, but it's the other big one in my view, which would also tip the balance even more. I did want to briefly talk about Israel itself when I spoke about the crisis of governance, and I think it's important to kind of touch on this a little bit. The Abraham Accords, are built on repression in the Gulf, but they also validate the worst tendencies in Israel, which is, I think, something that we haven't really talked about. They really do validate Netanyahu's approach, which is peace for peace rather than land for peace. So throughout the history of discussions and negotiations on the Palestinian issue, the framework for that has been land for peace. This idea that peace will happen when Israel returns lands to the Palestinians and to the other Arab states that it occupies. And Netanyahu's approach, he's not the first Israeli leader to coin this approach. It's Shamir before him and others. But his approach was that Israel should, rather than deal with the Palestinians at all or cede any land, it should focus on strengthening its economy, its military, and its relationship with states on the periphery. And that when it does that, it will be powerful enough that the Arab states will want to normalize with it in exchange for really nothing. And so that has been the hallmark of Netanyahu's approach since 2009. He has overseen the expansion of settlements massively across the West Bank. And initially, his approach was not endorsed or seen as even reasonable by the center in Israel. This idea of land for peace was still seen as, okay, if we're ever going to normalize relations with the Arabs, it has to be through land for peace. But he's pushed this through so much, and the Abraham Accords, I think, are the ultimate validation of the Netanyahu approach. It's no longer seen as an extremist peripheral view, but it's actually almost seen as an expectation now that, well, which Arab states are going to normalize next in exchange for nothing? And that's the really poor precedent that's been set for Israel itself. And I think it's worth talking about how this has also created a change in Israeli thinking around land and around peace and around occupation, and effectively stripped the past logic and the past incentives that used to be in place around land for peace as the framework, and instead validated his peace for peace approach, which is peace is going to happen in exchange for nothing. So that's another point that I wanted to add in. Other than this, I'm happy to turn over to the other speakers, panelists who have more insight on matters like Pakistan and maybe some of the other broader issues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adam. You've cruised through a lot of those questions, and that's really good. And I think, yeah, very insightful comments. Really pleased to hear that. Now, Shari, do you want to do something similar? Would you like to respond to anything you've heard so far, or go through the questions? It's really over to you. We're sort of freewheeling it a bit here.
Alam, that was amazing. You did such an incredible job. So I probably won't go question by question, because I think you actually responded in incredible ways. But I think there are a few things I do want to highlight. I guess that kind of responds in general to some of these questions, but also I think brings some of the threads I've been thinking about together as others have spoken. So the first is, like, we need to start maybe back to that thing about, you know, liberation and reexistence of Palestine, or the first question, that idea that Palestine isn't, I got the feeling from the question that there was a feeling that Palestine doesn't disrupt or doesn't do this work of acting in disruption. And I think that's kind of erasing all the incredible years and work of struggle of Palestinians. And so we should be really careful when we talk about solidarity from outside, that we're not also erasing the agency of Palestinians and the amount of risk and struggle and disruption on all levels of Palestinian practice, whether we're talking within West Bank, Gaza, whether we're talking about within the supposed Green Line, whether we're talking about refugees, whether we're talking about around the world, just to keep that the reason we have disruption, the reason we have BDS, the reason we have active solidarity around the world is because of Palestine and not from the other way. So we should just, I just wanted to highlight that is, and that just because normalization is a project that seeks to disappear Palestine doesn't mean Palestinians are pacified and agree to disappear. And actually there's, and we saw it in 2021 with this incredibly violent, what's called the Unity Intifada, where we're seeing people now on the ground literally fighting. Like, it's, I kind of feel like let's just keep that in our kind of conversations. And the second thing also, I guess, that I wanted to highlight is that it is amazing also the kind of way that spectacle of violence moves. We're talking about this, this newly extreme, which I don't think is new at all, version of the Israeli state and the right-wing Israeli state coming in and, initiating new acts on the ground, new violence on the ground, but perhaps a little bit more obviously with settlers and soldiers working together in a place like Quetta. But that's been going on for as long as I can remember in other ways. But also, like, we've shifted this gaze to like this violence in the West Bank as if the last, nearly 20 years of siege on Gaza hasn't happened, and constant every few years the destruction, inherent policy of constantly raising Gaza to the ground is like, and then the amount of destruction infrastructurally and in life, that happens there. And so It's an interesting thing to also keep in mind, that kind of what I was talking about before, about the way we disassociate spaces and experiences and violence and the way these things really become invisible in a way when we kind of focus our attention on the particular acts of violence in one place and miss all these other ways that it happens. So that's something else I wanted us to think about. How do we keep it all in sight, rather than kind of pick out this moment as something more extreme, because we're not looking at all of it at once. And I guess the third thing I wanted to bring up, which really came through in the way that Ilan was talking about what's happening in like kind of the project of normalization within the Middle East, is two things. Is one, to keep in mind, like, these collaborations were amplified with the Abraham Accords and becoming more visible and public now, but they've been going on for a really long time. We have like at least a decade, 2 decades of normalization projects since Gaza was contained. Like, we need to think about the fact that that did nothing to stop these security operations and surveillance operations. But it also then made me think about the fact that this isn't government to government, and we should stop talking about it as, did this state normalize relations with this state, as if it's only a diplomatic relationship or even a security or surveillance kind of relationship. This is also between huge conglomerates and companies and logistics operators and managers and labor. Like, it's all about that as well, that there's a lot, and that is key, like, to normalization, is that it's also private operators. And we tend to lose that when we talk about Israel as if it's one state, and all the and the UAE as if it's one, it's also lots of these kind of private operators that are key to normalizing these relationships. Then that's what I mean also by looking at what happens a little bit less visibly and under the radar. And that kind of also brings me to the fact that it's not just about security or surveillance. And I'm going to share my screen again, because I think this stuff is really interesting. And stop me if you think this is like super obvious, but I think it's important to notice things like this. So you have something called, the Food for Future Global AgTech Expo, and Adam Hania writes in his book on money markets and monarchies about kind of the importance of agro-tech and agro-conglomerates to kind of this recirculation, like the circulation of Gulf capital moving through the region and reorganizing the region. And so this like huge thing around food security. And if you look at they've got a food expo coming up. I was looking at this yesterday, and they're highlighting key innovators for the future of like food security in the region. And one of their big focus are like these new high-tech ways of doing this. And the first company that appears is a thing called Tevel. And when I was looking at the page, I went, Tevel. That immediately to me rings Hebrew. And so I went and looked it up. This is Tevel. I don't know if this will work well. If you can't see this, let me know, and I'm just babbling now. But Tevel and all of its big investors, and what it is I don't know if you can see the image here, but it's basically like this taking of drone technology and turning it into harvesting technology. And what it's selling is drones. There's if you want later, I can put a link for you in the chat for everyone to go and have a look at what they're doing. But what's amazing to me is not just thinking about the fact that you're highlighting Israel's security and surveillance capacities, but it's these other pieces. The other thing that it's normalizing, let's say in a technology like this, if you read what they're writing here, is also about removing labor and the problem or the expense or the disruption of using, in particular in Israel, foreign labor. And this being highlighted in the UAE, which is also a place that depends on foreign labor for so much of its construction, harvesting, any work that is kind of labor intensive. And it's giving you look, we'll bring you our drones, which we know that we created based on, and everybody, by the way, who's in, the other interesting thing here is anybody who's been on its, I wish I knew how to, here we go, team. Its key team, the people running this company, were all part of Israel Aeronautics, these guys, Dov Fatman, Nir Hassan, I can't really read it anymore. They were all people who obviously had their experience in the high-tech industries of Israeli military. So it's amazing how much it's all tied together. We have this thing about let's get rid of this really expensive and untrustworthy foreign labor through drone technology. Let's also sell our drone technology that we used on Palestine, which we brought to this UAE big, huge trade conference where a lot of these big trade conferences have, and so on and so forth. To me, that is the ultimate normalization project, is to make security infrastructure used in the everyday. And you see it over and over again in the way that Israel uses its technology and the way it's bought and sold and wanted by so many companies and countries in the world. And And that also brings back to the really wonderful thing Alam said about threading together all these different people's movements, I guess, or global movements around, you know, what Ruth Gilmore, I think, calls like changing everything, or what we might also call abolitionist movements, that it is about seeing the connection. And even though we also need to acknowledge that that connection is completely uneven, right? Like this doesn't all happen in the same way in same places, but this is the point before about saying like when one place is made mobile, another is made immobile, is that these things are all intimately connected, and these movements are becoming amazing at showing their intimate connection. And we're not just talking about the direct acts of violence, but also like the acts of capitalism, and we're talking about climate crisis, and we're talking about the way to think about the world as dependent and contingent on different relationships, different violence, and these movements are, including how Palestine threads through them in this incredible way, you know, enables us to do that work of collective solidarity and challenge, and I think in wonderfully new ways. So again, like let's end on that kind of wonderfully happy and positive note that Chandra brought, that these movements are happening and are powerful, and we shouldn't just assume that normalization or that violence or that oppression or that conquest is going to happen, because that also gets us off the hook of taking risks and participating. And so that's sort of what I wanted to say. And I'll leave some of the other much more. Oh, I did want to have that point about Adani. Somebody asked specifically about Adani, about like the benefit to Adani having 70% stake and Gadol the remaining 30% and so on, and that this just benefits Ghanaian. Yes, of course it benefits like the kind of catalyst interlocutors in this process, but normalization is also about just the legitimacy offered to the state of Israel and its relationship to India. And also Adani has spoken about the fact that, who is also a really huge like connected individual to Modi, like that active decision to invest in Israel actively decides that Israel is a legitimate partner in these big, you know, projects, something that India had not been part of but obviously that has changed. And there's like a really new, wonderful book that's coming out about normalizing India-Israel relationships. I think just came out with Pluto Press, that I would highly advise people to have a look at.
Okay. Kia ora, Shari, thank you very much for that. You've covered a huge amount of ground there. I was going to draw your attention to that one question, but you've covered that one. There's another one here. I just want to, in a sense, people have sent questions in, and so we'll cover the ones we haven't covered so far. And this is one from Albert Devakaram. Just, which is the group that Chandra represents, is urging the US, British, Australian, Canadian, Swiss, and the EU and the Arab League governments to lift what is termed the unjust, immoral sanctions against Syria in order to lessen the immense sufferings caused by the recent quake of February the 6th. Your comments, please. Yeah, make some quick comments there. Is that anybody want to?
Well, thanks, John. I'll just add very quickly to what has been said already about the sanctions against Syria. I'm glad to observe that there are demonstrations in the United States asking that these sanctions be lifted from church groups. And I'd been asked to participate in one of those discussions with a number of church groups. I think this is an interesting development. We don't know how far it will go, but one hopes that the momentum would be maintained and other groups would get involved in this struggle to get the sanctions lifted against Syria. If I may very quickly comment on this other question that I think Professor Junaid had asked about Pakistan. Well, what he said is absolutely true about why Imran Khan is targeted. This is certainly one of the main reasons. This is a very firm, clear, unequivocal stand on the question of Palestine and the rights of the Palestinian people. And there are other countries which I think are watching the situation very carefully, which is why if, let us say, the popular movement, this is a first-class example of a people's movement in Pakistan fails, then I think the elites in various parts of the world, they're going to say, well, we'll be able to handle it. But if on the other hand, the movement succeeds, it's going to have immense impact upon other people's movements, even small fledgling movements in other parts of the world. So it is so important that the people succeed in Pakistan. Unfortunately, if you look at the media, and this includes the media in the non-Western world, you'll find that they just repeat the reporting that is done in the Western media without looking at the real situation. There's no attempt, for instance, to send their own reporters to Pakistan, which for many Asian countries, it's not a faraway land, you know. They should be able to provide some insights into what's happening. They're not doing that. And this, to my mind, I think is at the heart of one of the major problems that faces us, the role of the media. And it's not just the mainstream media, mind you. It is the alternative media too, which does the same thing. They just mouth what the mainstream media does in some instances. And even when they adopt alternative positions, you'll find that they don't deal with the fundamental dimensions of major challenges. Thank you.
Yep, sorry, thank you very much, Chandra. I've had myself on mute again. Look, we've got two, we've got another question here as well, but there's two questions that have just come in. Two questions we haven't dealt with. So we'll do this very quickly if we can, because we're coming to the close of the question session. Somebody says, this is Dinesh Suna, says, first of all, a great dimension that I had not thought of. While Arab countries have been behind Palestinian liberation, while Arab countries have been behind Palestinian liberation, but those countries themselves have a very bad track record vis-a-vis human rights and democracy, does it really matter if these Arab countries normalise with Israel? Any quick comments on that, Elam or Shari? Does it really matter?
Sure, I'll maybe take this and share if you want to jump in. Yes, I think it does matter because while it matters for two reasons. First of all, they're part of a collective entity that was once almost uniformly supportive of the Palestinians. So when you have even peripheral states kind of breaking from a collective position, it matters to the centrality of, to the ability of that body to maintain coherence. So I think it matters tremendously to the general ability of the Arab states to collectively support Palestine. The reality is that they don't anymore, I think we can say, with these normalization agreements. The other issue is, I think we have to consider their importance within the either regional or global strategic landscape. I think a Palestinian politician made this point that amongst, you know, the Arabs, the population of the UAE and Bahrain are trivial, and so it doesn't matter if they normalize. And I see that point, but I think it matters if it's part of a bigger trend, which it seems to be, and it matters when you think about the importance of normalizing states within the general global or regional landscape. And I think this is where the question on Saudi Arabia becomes especially important. If Saudi Arabia and of course a country like Pakistan, if they follow this trend started by the smaller and maybe less significant states, then this becomes a bigger problem. But I think, yes, relevant because they've set something into motion now, which is rippling through. And I think I would also remember the fact that this has created a new infrastructure of covert, growing, not necessarily covert, but behind the scenes cooperation between Israel, the Arab states, and the United States. So that triangulation has been set into motion because of the accords sparked by these tiny countries. So it matters for that reason, I think. That's my answer to that.
Yeah. Thanks, Alan. Shari, do you have any comment on that?
I think I'm going to just agree with everything Alan says all the time. I think
likewise, we can just agree with each other.
No, but I think also like that ignores all the stuff we've been talking about with like normalization is a project of also like durable, like setting in stone this kind of durable relationship with Israel, making it, first of all, urgent, relevant partner, and also just making it seem like this has always been, right? Like, so it's not necessarily whether or not it's good countries liking good countries, bad countries liking, it's not actually about that. At its core, it is about just like, and Israel, in a crazy way, has always thought about this, the facts on the ground that are durable, that make it impossible to turn it back or seem like it, which I don't believe that that's true either, but that's how these kind of ahistorical processes work. And I'd actually like to hear Ilan's thoughts about that too, because I know he's thought about this for a long time. But I'm hoping, I didn't understand, there's another question there that said to Ilan, but I think it's Ilan who, you know, what does the Iranian Saudi deal disrupt Israeli normalization effort? Like, will the Iranian Saudi Arabia deal disrupt Israeli normalization efforts in any way? And I think Ilan was starting to talk about this earlier, as to how this operates. And I think, you know, just thinking about the fact that at the same time that we're, you know, representatives from the US involved in this conversation, I'm quite trepidatious to believe this is some kind of interruption in this process. I'd love to hear from Ilham, actually.
So yeah, do you want Ilham or Ilan? I think we don't know very much about the Iran-Saudi normalization efforts, but definitely Iran has the potential to act as a counterweight to this. If Iran can be brought back into the fold a little bit, the reality is now that it's not. So much of what we're seeing is, in fact, shaped to counter Iran. That it's built to oppose Iran, right? All of these normalization efforts. So to the extent which Iran can actually be brought into the fold, if this is the beginning of that, I'm reluctant to be too optimistic about this, but that is potentially a counterweight to this trend, of course. Again, I'm reluctant to comment too much because we don't know. This was announced yesterday and the contours are not that clear. But I think important to note that one way of seeing much of this is in opposition to Iran. So that would be a very big shift if Iran were to be brought back, and then push Israel out would be actually the opposite of what's happening now. It would be a complete reversal of what's happening now.
Right. Thank you, Elam, and thanks, Shari. Look, that's a really good question or really good point to bring Ilan into this conversation. So Ilan has the job of bringing some threads from this discussion and looking at how things might move going forward. So Ilan, I'll welcome you to the conversation and ask you to address that question first of all. So this was a question for Ilan: will the new Iranian-Saudi deal disrupt Israeli normalization efforts in any way? And this was a deal which was brokered by China and just announced yesterday. But just before you go, before you start, Ilan, I've got to introduce you properly. So Professor Ilan Pappé is an expatriate Israeli historian and a socialist activist. He's a professor with the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter in the UK, director of the university's European Centre for Palestinian Studies, and co-director of the Exeter Centre for Ethno-Political Studies. So welcome to the conversation, Ilan. Looking forward to what you have to say. Go on.
Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. Mute. Oh, no. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, John. I think I'm now unmuted properly. And Ilham and Shari for your and Dr. Chandra for your incredible contribution, and Jones for your introduction. Yeah, because before I go to my kind of general remarks, which will be very short, as so much has been already said and elaborated by previous speakers. As far as Iran and Saudi Arabia, as Ilham rightly says, we don't know yet enough about it to factor it into our understanding of the future. But we can say that there are certain international regional actors and local actors on the ground in Palestine, such as the Hamas, that if the international community or the regional community of states, I'm not talking about the societies, of states, would be willing to pressure to legitimize their involvement in the issue of Palestine, this could definitely be a game changer in many, many ways, because the language would be different, the discourse would be different. But as Ilham rightly said, we don't know yet how significant this is. Maybe it is something there, but we have to wait and see, I think, on that. So I'm sorry if the person who asked the question is not fully satisfied by either Ilham's or mine powers of prediction. But I think we should be cautious here. we need to wait on this one. Generally speaking, I think so much has already been said that talking about the way forward is even something that all of you have already covered as well. So I just want to add few points rather than really repeat what already has been said so forcefully and so clearly. One is, I think that sometimes these webinars and the discussions between us are a bit in a bubble, in the sense that we are talking to ourselves as people who have a similar discourse, a similar agency, a similar way of looking at things, and we are looking for ways of expanding our audiences, so to speak, and think of what can we add to their knowledge and understanding, which is lacking. And I was thinking, for instance, about the recent developments in Israel, and I'm not just talking about the elections, but also the demonstrations of the Israeli social and economic elite that many of you are probably aware of, either visually or through information. I was watching the way newspapers such as the New York Times or the Guardian, and in particular, I'm looking at the liberal left, so to speak, in the West, analyzed these developments. And it just leaves you with the impression that there's so much work still to be done in even beginning a logic conversation with people who are kind of signifying the more open-minded part of the Western society, and how far they are from grasping the essence of what goes on in Israel and Palestine, or for even being able to contribute in any constructive way to the reality on the ground. So I think we should continue and talk to people and not give up on them, and frame in the right way the situation in Israel, and identify, and I think Shari already said that the whole idea that there's something very different has happened in Israel is ridiculous. It's just another stage in a process that has already been going on for many years. But I think it's important to therefore to repeat the things we have said even before that crisis. This whole idea of Albert Mami, of the leftist colonizer, the liberal colonizer, that is actually someone who mentally cannot go out of the perception of colonialism, in this case, settler colonialism. This extends beyond Israel. I don't think that there's much to be talked about the left in Israel, although this new energy of the social and cultural, mostly European Jewish elite in Israel and their, oops, something. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay, I know my picture is a bit bizarre, but anyway, this whole, let me try it again. Okay, that's better. The whole idea that we are just talking about the left in Israel, or the liberal, the elites in Israel, is too restricted. There is a whole audience, there's a whole groups of people especially in the West, but not only in the West, who somehow see a lifeline in the fact that there is this resistance in Israel, almost trying to revive this fantasy Israel that is really still a democracy. Look how these people are fighting for this. You know, and comparing it to the Arab Spring, comparing it to the movement in Pakistan, comparing it to others. This is it's not dangerous, because I think most of us understand what it really stands for. But I think it is important to make sure that people understand the nature of this resistance, what it resists to, and how does it not deviate from the settler colonial reality, mentality, and frameworks. I think that's one thing we should, I know we all understand it, but I don't think that we realize how much it is misunderstood beyond our our comfort zone of people who talk the same language and understand each other very well. And I think someone already, I don't remember who, mentioned correctly that the rise of this extreme right wing in Israel is also because of the normalization. This is very important. I mean, not that I want to cast the blame on the Arab regimes for the kind of government that Israel has now, but it should be analyzed in a way. I mean, the normalization allowed the Israeli electorate to believe that there's no need even for the charade of democracy or human rights if this is how the region reacts to Israeli policies and attitudes. Now, the second point that was, I think Ilham brought it up and came up also in the questions, and I think Shari and Dr. Chandra also commented on this, is how far do we give up on the Arab and Muslim world? I mean, since we are kind of seeing this flood of normalization agreements, states queuing to normalize a relationship with Israel. Maybe a historical perspective here is very important. Some political scientists have a tendency to close the chapter of what was wrongly called the Arab Spring, but this is the resistance and revolutions in the Arab world to reshape the post-colonial world that was very much focused on state but not on societies. And I think that historically every revolution has a counter-revolution, and we haven't seen yet the maturation of the way civil societies, either in the Arab world or the Muslim world, and I think Pakistan in this respect is very important, have been able to bridge the gap that Dr. Chandra was talking about between elites and non-elites and the agendas of elites and non-elite. I think we are in the middle of the process rather than at the end of it, where we can kind of say, this is the way it's going. The very complex global economic and ecological issues are not over yet, and somehow I think that it is very important for a country like Palestine that was de-Arabized culturally, geographically, politically, demographically, to be strongly and organically part of the Arab and the Muslim world. Therefore, I don't think we can really get out of this conversation. We just have to be part of the same movements of resistance and change, and make sure that Palestine is not isolated as something that is different from anything else that's going on in Lebanon, Syria, or elsewhere. Situations are different from country to country, but reintegrating organically Palestine, and culturally, and politically, and economically, Palestine to the hinterland, the Arab hinterland, the Muslim hinterland, the Muslim civilization, is one of the most important part of any successful decolonization process in the future. The obvious was already stated by some of you, the whole idea that Pax Americana is the only way of bringing peace and reconciliation, I think, is something else that we can hammer in again. Although we have talked about it and we all agree about it, I think it is still not easily understood, and I think this is important, but I won't kind of dwell on it. I think that's very clear. It brings us all to this idea that I think many of us are aware of, that a project like Zionism has two pillars on which it stands: the moral pillar and the material pillar. And for many years, many of us thought that we are very successful, and rightly so, in undermining the moral pillar. It was, I mean, even without a very successful and efficient Palestinian campaign on this, sometimes it self-erodes. It implodes from the inside. There's something, when something is morally and sinful in its origins, it cannot be sustained for long, even without a serious challenge from its victims. And sometimes the victims are much better, sometimes are less better in challenging, and it depends a lot on the regional and international support for their agency. But I think what we found out lately, that in a very bizarre way, the moral issue now impacts the material pillar. This is not because I think many of us are particularly interested in that kind of process or are that enthusiastic about it, but we should pay attention to the fact that because Israel is so closely connected to the neoliberal and neo-capitalist world, its image of instability is causing economic hardship for the state of Israel. High-tech money is getting out of Israel. The Israeli kind of credibility is under danger, as in all these agencies that are framing Israel as, which until now framed Israel as a very successful and stable and thriving economy. I'm saying this because I don't think this is the way to decolonization. I don't think that the neo-capitalist or neoliberal of Israel would bring it down, or would definitely not in the short term future would ease the oppression of the Palestinians. I'm just saying that exactly the opposite, that we should not be mesmerized by the implosion from inside Israel by giving up of the need to build a post-colonial vision, by asking the Palestinians who have, as Shari rightly reminded us, they have agency, they showed resilience, they showed resistance. We're not wiping it out, but I think they still owe us some sort of guidance on the collective Jewish presence in Palestine, in post-colonial, liberated, decolonized Palestine. I think this is important. And sometimes when you think that the implosion from the inside, you somehow say, what do I have to do? I mean, anyway, these guys are going to either eat each other or kind of, collapse from the inside, but that's not enough. I think one of the reasons we had what we have in the post-colonial Arab world was exactly that, the destruction of the colonial and imperial powers did not mean that the issue of the post-colonial world were properly dealt with and built. And I think this is a good point. My very, very final point is not to forget the incredible phenomenon that I can only describe, and I will not dare to give it a name, but I think it's important to take it into account when we think about the way forward. We are in the third intifada. Any talk about will there be a third uprising is ridiculous. We are in the third uprising. We always think that uprisings, the third one would look like the second one or the first one. No, it has its own characteristic. And one of its the two most important characteristics, which I think we should ask ourselves as a solidarity movement, how best we can help there. The two characteristics which deserve further pondering on our side, and John, with this I end. I'm sorry I've taken more than probably I should have. One is that this is a focus on decolonization, sometimes on an individual level, local level, the village level, the town level, without bothering and asking us not to bother too much now about the question of the so-called solution or the vision. This is a struggle that asks for all the energies and all the agencies to survive the struggle of very brave young people who know that they don't have the power to end the oppression or the occupation, but they say they don't have the luxury to stop the struggle. And we have to think about it. We have to think about it. This is decolonization that is taking place without a very clear vision of post-colonialism. It happened in history before, by the way. Sometimes it ends very disastrously. Sometimes it's actually a prelude for a much better period, but we have to be aware of it. The second one, and it's connected, we are in a non-solutionism era. This is a non-solutionism era. The discourse on the ground, the discourse inside Israel among the Palestinians, the discourse is a discourse that says this is not the point now. The word solution is not an interesting word or concept. It's a very good question whether from the outside, this is something we just accept and we say, okay, so what do you need? Or because of the very complex Palestinian situation that has inside and outside and has exile, and although never developed the concept of government in exile, what is the more global pan-Palestinian discussion on this, giving the sacrifices paid by the young people themselves on the ground? I will just mention one example. Not every Palestinian outfit that was involved in the Unity Intifada in 2021 did good service to the Unity Intifada. which was an amazing moment in the history of Palestine. But some, I won't mention names, but some organizations took it over and diverted it to a less healthy direction, in my mind. This could have been a far more powerful potential explosion in the chapter of decolonization. So this whole sensitive interreaction between outside and inside, strategizing and envisioning, and the actual people who are sacrificing their life courageously in resistance and resilience is also something for the way forward. Not that I have a way forward for it. I'm just saying I'm flinging it up as something that should be discussed and elaborated further. So thank you very much for everyone. And it was an incredible webinar, at least from my point of view. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ilhan. It's always a pleasure to listen to you and your kind of insights. Yeah, I think that I hadn't heard that we live in a non-solution era. I hadn't sort of never processed that before, but that's an interesting observation about where we are. So thank you very much for that. And so I want to close it up now. It's gone. We're well over time, actually. We were supposed to be just maybe a bit more than an hour and a half, or almost 2 hours. So I'm going to thank everybody. Thank, first of all, well, Professor Pape, and thank Chandra. I'll go away with this, Chandra, feeling very positive for your very, very positive kind of overview of how you see the situation. But the biggest thanks really is to Elham and Shari. Your presentations were incredibly stimulating and incredibly interesting. And I think they kind of, for me, they gave a very clear, lucid picture of where we are with no frills attached. And I think that was incredibly valuable. So I want to thank you, the two of you, especially for that. That was absolutely fantastic. And yeah, so that ends it for us. And yeah, so kua mutu, as Māori would say, that's the end. And thank you all thanks to our panelists, and thanks to everybody online, and thanks to the people who asked questions. Thanks to everyone. So kia ora koutou, and have a lovely day wherever you are. I'm just about to head to bed. It's almost midnight here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It was amazing.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.